Hi, everyone. My name is Catherine Ridley, and I am the Vice President of Education and Communications at 100 Miles. We're a nonprofit with a mission of protecting and preserving Georgia's 100-mile coast through advocacy, education, and citizen engagement. Thank you all for joining us tonight for our third week of this year's Choosing to Lead conference. We're all here tonight because we believe that Georgia's coast is a wonder of the world, worthy of our pride and deserving of our protection. It's a testament to just how many people share that commitment to saving this special place that we've had such a large and engaged audience willing to devote their own time to these important conversations. By participating tonight, you're choosing to lead and to care about our coast, and we couldn't be more grateful. You know, we started this conference 5 years ago because we recognized that advocacy can sometimes be a scary thing. It takes courage to stand up for what's right, to take action, to tell our own stories, and to encourage those around us to do the same. We hope that over the course of these 5 weeks, you're finding the knowledge and the tools you need to make a difference for our coast in your own way, in your own time. Tonight's conversation will move our conservation community forward in important ways, but only if we all act on what we learn. We encourage you to visit 100miles.org/conference to explore these topics even further and to come up with your own action plan. As always, we want to recognize our sponsors for their generous support and for all that they've done to make this event possible. So thank you to Southern Ionics Minerals, Rayonier Advanced Materials, and Cumberland Island Conservancy, along with many of our other dedicated nonprofit partners for your sponsors for your continued support and partnership. You can learn more about all of our sponsors and their work along Georgia's coast in our virtual exhibit hall on our conference webpage. Thank you all for being here tonight and for loving Georgia's coast as much as we do.
Thanks, Catherine. Good evening. My name is Megan DeRosiers, and I am the CEO of 100 Miles. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight for this very important conversation. The question we are asking is, how can we do better? At 100 Miles, this question is very important because the quests for environmental protection and social justice are all about equitable distribution of resources, of recognition, of value. Environmentalists have eyes that have been trained to see how Americans undervalue and often exploit natural resources like air, water, trees, minerals, etc. We challenge permit applications for projects that will dump chemicals into our water and air, or that will destroy important resources like forests and salt marshes or our oceans. We've learned that this type of advocacy is necessary because the local, state, and federal regulators that are supposed to protect these resources for all Americans have come to believe that the project applicant is the client, and the natural resources that our regulatory systems were meant to safeguard are viewed as free commodities that the regulators are responsible for doling out to people and corporations who will diminish them. Environmentalists have learned that we must watchdog and speak up about the injustice of this viewpoint and the resulting practices. But quite honestly, it is an uphill battle, and the result is a death by 1,000 cuts to important resources that this planet and its inhabitants need to survive. During 2020, while I was sitting in my home watching events unfold, I realized that the same government systems that failed Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and countless others throughout history, the same corporations that undervalue and underpay America's workforce of essential grocery store employees, restaurant workers, first responders, teachers, and others on the front lines of our society, and the same education paradigm that has for generations passed underperforming children along through the grades because the schools were ill-equipped to educate them. Those are the same systems, entities, and paradigms that are exploiting our natural resources and destroying this planet. This nation was founded, and our systems were established by people who believe that natural resources and labor are commodities to be exploited. They also believed that Black and brown people were not created equal and therefore did not deserve equal rights or treatment. The systems that our founding fathers and those who came after established still exist today. As a result, today, both our people and our planet are suffering, and the suffering is a negative feedback loop that just perpetuates more exploitation and suffering. Think Flint, Michigan drinking water, Superfund sites in Brunswick, cancer clusters in children living a few miles apart in Waycross. We are hosting this conversation tonight because at 100 miles, we can see that the path to saving this planet is the same path that leads to an end to hunger, poverty, and education disparities, but only if we commit to walking together to challenge the systems that have failed to protect both our people and our planet. As long as profit is the primary metric of success in this country, and people in power are seen by the regulators as their clients instead of the American people, the importance of indicators like human health, water and air quality, education, and the quality of our natural resources like forests and marshes will continue to be ignored and discounted. This journey starts with us listening and relearning. Paul Simon sings a line, "This is the story of how we begin to remember." Tonight starts the story of how we begin to learn from each other, of how we begin to find connections in our experiences and our histories. This is the story of how we begin to see society more clearly and how we begin to understand the truth and to change. I would like for us to be guided by empathy and vulnerability. No matter where you are on your scale of awareness and emotion, we have to leave here committed to continuing to listen and learn and beginning to work together in bigger ways to cause change for the health of people and this planet. I am so lucky to be here tonight with two amazing humans, Drew Lanham and Josiah Watts. Both have worked on environmental and social justice issues in the Southeast for decades, and although they hadn't ever met before a few weeks ago, their work has intersections and commonalities that you will recognize as they speak. Drew and Jazz, I am honored to be hosting this conversation with you, and I am so grateful to both of you for your time and for your life commitment to the work that you do. And of course, thank you for being here with us tonight. So I'm going to kick it off by diving right in, and I'm going to ask both of you, it's up to you who goes first, to take about 5 minutes to tell us a little bit about yourselves and what drives you to do what you do every day.
Jazz?
Yeah, okay, I'll go ahead. So my name is Josiah Watts. I go by Jazz. I'm a writer and actor, and activist. I'm a writer of a performance piece called the Sapelo Project. It's about the island where my maternal side of my family is from. I am an advisor to an organization called SICARS on the Sapelo Island Cultural and Revitalization Society, and I advise on land retention issues. I'm also a co-founder of an organization called the 223 Foundation that was founded in Brunswick, Georgia, after the brutal murder and killing of one of my younger cousins, Ahmaud Arbery. I also work with an organization called the Center for Community Progress as a consultant under a project called the Vulnerable Coastal Community Initiatives, where we look at environmental challenges that deal with things like climate resiliency and groundwater issues as well. And I'm born and raised in the area. Mom was from Sapelo, my dad was from St. Simons. And I always tell people that I had the best of both worlds. I lived down the street from Miss Bessie Jones and the Sea Island Singers. If anyone knows who they were just a phenomenal group of people. And growing up, on Sapelo as well. So yeah, I'm honored to be here and look forward to having this conversation with everyone that's here. Thank you.
it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Jazz, for letting me into this space. I'm a South Carolina boy, but Georgia born. Born in Augusta, Georgia. Grew up in Edgefield, South Carolina, which is just east of Augusta. And so, growing up, Augusta, we called it going to town from where I was, because we were in the middle of the woods, essentially on a family farm that's been in my family since late 1800s, early 1900s, or so we think. But growing up on the land that way, with our own cows, with our own vegetable gardens, with our own orchards, with my grandmother, the first person I ever saw feeding birds, tossing handfuls of grits out to the sparrows, because she pitied them, and she said God kept his eye on them, so she would too. That was sort of my root. And I mentioned to Jazz, sort of in the green room, that I had been listening to his performance of Maybe the Last Time, and it just brought back these memories of growing up rurally. So we would spend all this time in the country, but then I'd go to Augusta, of course, and I could see James Brown we could see James Brown walking up and down Broad Street. But there was also, I can remember the specter of Lester Maddox in the Act Family, right? And so the issues of land and race were always close by for me. But some of my relatives only got to Edgefield because they came through Jekyll Island on the Wanderer. So a 3-year-old girl who came to be known as Lucy came in on the Wanderer and was sold up the river, literally up the Savannah River, to Edgefield. And so that's part of my root. Part of my root is in Georgia. And as I teach my students, I'm a college professor, I'm an ornithologist, I'm sort of a bird brain, I'm a poet, and I'm a writer. And so I try to bring all of these things together convergently in a way that takes the science of climate change, that takes the science of habitat loss, that takes the social phenomenon of heirs property and land loss, and wraps all of that together, often through a bird's eye view. So having the opportunity a couple of years ago with 100 Miles sponsoring an island hopping trip was incredible to me. And it made such an impression off the Captain Gabby of visiting those islands and feeling home in them in a way. And that has stuck with me. And so I'm honored to be here to have this conversation tonight with Jazz, and hope it won't be the last time that we're together.
Thank you both. You both said some things that I want to, I've been taking notes, so I want to bring them up. You talked about your connection to the land, and you talked about home, both of you, and your roots in the Southeast and in coastal Georgia. And and Catherine said it earlier, that we believe that our coast is a wonder of the world. And most of us here tonight who are watching you and listening to what you're saying, we have a connection, we feel a connection with nature and with the wilderness around us. And so I would love for you to just explain or elaborate a little bit more on what you see when you look out at our landscape. How do you see this wonder of the world? How do you define it? What are the values that you hold for it?
I'll go first. So for me, I see a number of things. My fondest memories are, the time that I spent with my grandparents and extended family. I always remember even being young and spending summers on Sapelo with my grandmother and my great grandmother, and they were walkers from the Walker family, and they ironically were known for walking extremely fast. And I would have these little legs, and I'd always have to try to keep up with them. And they would say, my cousin would tell me that if you would see my grandmother from afar, it would look like she was floating while she was walking, because she was walking so fast. And then she'd have to turn around and stop and just tell me, "Come on here," because I'm struggling to try to keep up. And I think about St. Simon's, just, being around and having the privilege of growing up around, people like Miss Bessie Jones and the Sea Island Singers. So, you know, when I look at the space that I grew up in, I see a lot of things. I see, you know, obviously I see nature, because I was so close to it. I mean, there's something about, you know, being on the very ground that your ancestors walked on, that your ancestors bled on, that your ancestors, you know, died on, the very mud that's under your feet. There's power in that, you know. So I see that, but I also see that struggle, and I see the pain, that is also, you know, associated with that. So it's really a mix of both, and understanding and having, you know, that closeness, to nature, you know, and knowing what it, you know, feels like to get up in the morning from, you know, a rooster and not an alarm clock, or, you know, spend time in the creek and playing, and you know, at that time not realizing how precious, you know, those things were, until, you know, I would, you know, grow up and now see all of these other things too, because with that beauty also comes, you know, ugliness, you know, as well. You know, like, you know, for instance, and I'll you know, talk about this further, but on, you know, Sapelo, we're dealing with, you know, the ills of development and developers and people wanting to, you know, build, you know, private docks and all these other things that we have to push back and fight against. You know, also when I think of, you know, what I see on our landscape, I also think about the pain. You know, like I mentioned, you know, Ahmaud Arbery was a younger, you know, cousin of mine. So when I think of the landscape, I also think about, you know, there's a landscape out there that created people, you know, that do evil and do bad things. So it's, you know, it's a mixture for me, you know, along with beauty and power and grace. You know, I also feel, you know, the pain and the struggle, you know, of the people that I come from, and I am descendant from as well, and those challenges, you know, to present day.
Yeah, you know, Jazz, that bittersweet, right?
Yeah.
Is something that, you know, ashes to ashes, you know, and that's where we go, but the soil is also from where we spring. And so those connections are critical, for me as a scientist, but as a country boy, again, as someone who was used to getting water out of a spring, right? And was wondering what that funky taste was when I went to school, and you know, it was chlorine. And
yeah.
But those islands, and being there and thinking about the connections to my home place, and not just those places that I inhabit now in South Carolina and the islands there, but going back through the Wanderer and thinking about that passage from, and those enslaved, some of those folks were coming from deeper within Africa. And those connections, you know, as I watch birds fly overhead, I always think about those birds carrying messages. And I think about the birds that flew over my ancestors' heads, and that at times, as their backs were bent in toil and pain and wondering when their day would come, that they could look up and see the same, maybe the ancestors of the same birds that I am seeing were birds that gave them hope of a better day to come. And so those connections, I think, are critical, and they're stories that we don't tell enough, and that a lot of people don't want to hear. But I think conversations like this are important, because people ask the question there, how do we get more Black people out of the nature? We're out in nature.
Right.
We're out. We've been there, right? We may not be there like you want to see us, but we've been there. You know, people talk about catch and release fishing. I say, well, they catch and release is just in a pan of grease. So, you know, you got to understand,
yeah.
You know, the land has sustained us bitter and sweet.
Yeah.
And I think meeting us where we are on a landscape, right? And understanding that history, and not turning away from the bitter of it, but listening to what folks have to say, you know, and now the lands that people, where they had us, that were mosquito ridden and snake infested and all of this other sort of stuff, fever infested, now everybody wants their little slice of it.
Everybody.
And to push people out and to push Black folk out so they can have paradise. Well, you know, gentrification doesn't just happen in cities, it happens in conservation too. And that's an issue. And it's an elephant sort of in the room that we don't talk about a lot in conservation. But we can't just think about wild animals and these connections. We got to think about people on the landscape. And that's what I'm all about. And I'm happy that we're enjoying these conversations.
You know, when you bring that up, it made me think about when I was little, I would always see, you know, these, you know, what at the time would be students or researchers. And, you know, and I would always see these people, they'd be in the march or, you know, in all these places, they'd have like these little devices or they'd be digging, you know, and doing just all these different things. And, you know, as I got, you know, older, I recognized, oh, okay, well, they're studying nature, you know, right? And, you know, and like you say, you grow up on, you know, especially, you know, places like where we grew up and we're surrounded, you know, by nature. We're a part of the ecosystem, you know, whether it's the birds or the snakes or any of these things, or even, you know, the fish in the water. But what was always amazing to me back then is that there was just never a lot of interaction, right? And that's one of the bridges that I want to, you know, to make sure that I continue to build, you know, that bridge between, you know, conservation and environmental awareness, you know, and social justice and the community, because, you know, without the people, you're missing a large part of that very ecosystem that you're studying, you know. So when I see, you know, communities like my own going through, you know, these different challenges, like you talk about with the land and finding development and things like that, I always think to myself, well, they should be concerned too, because if the people are gone, you're losing a major part of that ecosystem. You know, there is a part that they play, whether it's, you know, feeding the birds or enjoying the nature or studying, you know, species or understanding. I always think about when, you know, students or researchers would come to the island and they're trying to figure out certain places where to go, where best to do their research. Guess who knows all that? The people. The people that are there,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's, you know, I think, Jazz, about, you know, I think about Harris Neck, you know, and how Harris Neck came to be. And I think about how sort of wildness is redefined for a different convenience or maybe different perception. But, you know, I think about, and I know there was rice culture there as well. But so many people think that all of this just happened, you know, and sure, there are wild places without human footprints, but not many. And so to discount the labor and the genius of others who have come before and been able to survive in environments in these wild places with natural resources, whether it's by, you know, oysters out of the creek or forests on the uplands and timbering, not giving credit where credit is due is part of the problem in current conservation. And, you know, culture has been erased in many ways. And then again, people want to solve the problem of getting us back into it. Well, you shouldn't have pushed us out of it or pushed us off of it. And I always think, man, that one of the great opportunities that we have here in the South is to move forward from a social justice perspective in a different way than anybody can anywhere else. Because when you look at where most of our roots as Black Americans are, they're on this Southeast coast. and folks understanding that they have blood, sweat, and tears in that pluff mud, in that marsh mud, is a critical thing. And I think once we begin to let those stories come out again, that people understand that we have been connected and continue to be connected. The problem is issues frequently of disconnection, not by our own doing. Certainly that happens. I'm not saying we're faultless, but when folks come in and cut the cord, you know, when people can't afford the tax base, right? You know, and all of a sudden you can't afford to live where your people have always lived.
That's right.
And the next thing you know, land that they told you is worthless is selling for tens of millions of dollars, and you're shut out. So, you know, those are the hard issues that as you watch birds, you take those binoculars down and you can get a better view. And I always tell folks, take your binoculars down for a little bit and look at the context. That marsh that's out there that was formed by people planting rice, it's capturing a lot of carbon. That marsh grass is capturing a lot of carbon. It's still doing the work. Those impounded marshes in many cases are still doing the work that people hundreds of years ago created them to do, but in a different way. So legacy is important. The connections are important. And I think, you know, again, man, with what you're doing and telling stories, you know, how did you come to put this on stage? I mean, that intrigues me as a writer, to see performance and to see voice go into it. How did you come to that?
So try to make it a not too long, but basically what happened is I was doing some work at Emory University, and I'd acted in a number of productions, and they had this festival called Brave New Works. At the same time, our community was going through this huge tax fight with the county, where our property tax bills went up 500 to 1,000%. My mom's bill was once, you know, 200 something, and she gets a bill that's over 2,000. I think it's a mistake. I called the county, and they go, no, there was this reassessment. So all of a sudden we find ourselves, you know, as you say, fighting to survive and fighting to stay on the land. And besides the actual advocacy and activism that was going on, because we had a lot of help. We had, you know, Michael Thurman got involved, a guy named Jeffrey George, who was just incredibly phenomenal, and an attorney, Jay Roberts. What was my next weapon? What was my next way of expression to tell people about it? And it was to write. I'd reached out to the New York Times, and they were writing, and what was missing was me writing. And so the Sapelo Project was partially about writing about this, you know, this rich history, and in a sense, trying to get people not only to understand and to see us, but to care what was happening. And at the same time that I was working on and writing this, my mother was very ill, and she would pass away right before that production happened. But, you know, in a sense, what was happening for me was using every resource that I had to tell the stories that people needed to hear, you know, because I think that's part of the problem, right? Is that, you know, people aren't hearing our stories or about what the actual truth is. You know, history is told in a way that is not completely truthful, you know, and I guess that's one way of saying that. And that's how Sapelo came to be, that project came to be, as a way of a message, as a way of just, you know, saying to people that, you know, that they should care. You know, they should care that there's a small barrier island. You know, maybe there's not many people, but they should care. They should care more than just about you, whether it's the baskets or the nets or all of these things. They should care about the people. They should care about the culture. They should care about protecting, you know, the land and learning about the true legacy and the history that happened there, so that we can all face and have discussions about it.
Thank you.
It's beautiful.
It is. You both are amazing. And I really love that you're talking about telling the truth and sharing your stories with other people. Because that's in our definition at 100 miles, that's what advocacy is. It is sharing what you love with others so that they may too come to understand and value it. That's absolutely what advocacy is. And Jazz, you and I met because we were working on Butler Island together, and now we're working on Sapelo, on projects on Sapelo together. And so I want to make sure you have a chance, and this is it, to talk a little bit about what's going on there and how maybe some of the stories are being ignored or haven't been told. And if they were told, maybe the state or private developers or whomever would see those resources as different.
Yeah, so we actually met through some work on Butler Island, and you know, and I commend again Butler descendants, McIntosh residents, and 100 miles as far as, you know, killing that bill that would have sold Butler Island. But yeah, we're dealing with a development issue right now on Sapelo Island, where, you know, a newer landowner has, you know, put in a request to build a private recreational dock right, you know, in the community. And we are a historic community on the National Registry, and that was, you know, back in '96, and it is a struggle, you know, and a challenge. And, you know, Sapelo has we have a main dock that, you know, has a state ferry, but what we have now are people, you know, that are not only, you know, developing, you know, homes that are, you know, out of code and zoning ordinances, but, you know, now you have these folks who are requesting and saying that they want to have their own private, you know, recreational, you know, dock, you know, in a historic community, which violates everything when it comes to, you know, our protections. And we're talking about a dock that this person wants to build in the same waters where our families and our ancestors, you know, were baptized, the same waters where, you know, we survived and we lived off the land. Those very same waters. And it just shouldn't have to be. It's not necessary, you know. And so right now we are in, we've already requested a hearing with the Army Corps of Engineers, and of course 100 miles. You guys have been so supportive. We wrote a letter, you know, to them as well, expressing our opposition to this, you know, to this recreational dock. So our hope is that we're going to be able to stop it. We don't want to see Sapelo turn, you know, into, you know, a Hilton Head, or unfortunately like a St. Simon's that is just overly developed. And people, and if you want to have more information about how you can support us, you can go to sicars.org, and that's SICARS.org. And we would appreciate any and all support. And we want support from any and everyone. We feel that, you know, the Marine Institute, we're hoping that they'll support us, you know, the corridor, and just every organization that's out there, the Conservancy, Center for Sustainable Coast, and just everyone. So yes, thank you for giving me time to speak on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Drew, I'd love for you to respond, because you were talking about the overdevelopment of areas and how when an area is developed, it's not just the nature that's lost, but it's the history that's lost. And I would love if you could comment on that.
Well, Megan, you know, it's, you know, just up the coast is that example, right? Like Hilton Head and places like that have suffered in large part because people decide that they want the millage rate goes up to what people who were living there can't afford. And then the next thing you know, everything is private, you know, the docks, and there's no access to places to fish or oyster or do the things that that you've always done. So, you know, there's this necessary, and especially here in the South, this necessary convergence between conservation and culture that we got to think about, and that doesn't come in into this conservation conversation often enough. I remember being at a meeting a few years back, and it was a coastal meeting here in South Carolina, but people were mapping out, these places for animals to go, right? And I'm looking at this map, and I just came to this meeting at the last minute. I'm looking at this map, but I know some of the communities. I'm like, wait a minute. And I'm thinking, and they were planning without ever having anybody from those communities at the table. And many of those communities were Black communities. And they were talking about, well, this will be a great place for this species to grow through or migrate. And I'm looking around and I'm like, I wonder who speaks for folks there. So, you know, we can talk about, you know, development in terms of concrete and docks and those kinds of things, but we can also talk about people being ignored so that places can be rewilded on top of them. And that's the disrespect and a development of a different kind. And sometimes it's difficult for people to get their heads around, but it's not listening, right? It's not listening to people. It's not watching. It's not paying attention. And when you're not doing that, then that's just out and out disrespect. And I think that part of the issue as we think about how we live in the environment, and folks want to, you know, create their own paradises and those kinds of things, we got to consider culture, and we got to consider that as a necessary cog in this wheel. And if we don't think about it as a cog in the wheel, then we're going to suffer. We're gonna suffer all the consequences of things that we're seeing even now. But you know, it's as my grandmother used to say, live long enough, and you'll see these things come to pass. And so now, you know, we're seeing the impacts of climate change, but this development, it just exacerbates it. And then when you decide, well, we will take these places, but then we want to rewild here, it just keeps marginalizing people, and it keeps marginalizing. And then you wonder why they don't want to see you coming, why they see that logo and they're like, wait, that's that's not a conservation logo. Those are people who are trying to move me out. So if we don't act proactively to do that, Megan and Jazz, I think we're going to continue, conservation is going to continue to suffer an image problem, much of which it has created. And so I go back and I give credit, I give props to 100 Miles, because I saw from the get-go, I saw y'all doing things down there that weren't happening up the coast, right? And I think anybody can learn from anybody else, especially your next door neighbor. Yeah. So, you know, I believe it's important because y'all are downstream of us, right? But birds aren't recognizing that. You know, you have a whole culture that's built along that stretch that's not recognizing borders. So, you know, I want to do what I can, however I can, to make sure that we think about culture just as much as we think about wildness. It's critical.
I want to ask you both, as storytellers, you know, I think part of the problem is that, like, when we're thinking about a landscape, we think of it as either what we see if it's wilderness, like a marsh or a forest, or the other alternative is we see it as a subdivision, a housing subdivision, right? And what I have learned from both of you is that there's a history to our landscapes, especially in the Southeast, that people don't talk about. And the people that are talking about it are people who already know it. And so there's a whole big group of people, including the DNR board, including our local elected officials, who don't know that history that relates to the culture, because the people that are promoting the vision are either the developers or the conservationists. And I would love for you to expand on that and to help us figure out, how do we make those links as a community so that it doesn't just fall on one person's shoulders, but maybe we create a partnership to do it?
Yeah, no, I think you hit it, right on the head. If people understood or actually knew the historical legacy behind or the history, the true history is, it's not enough to write a book about history that talks about the quote unquote technical aspect of things, or like one I always hear is when a historical text about a slave owner, and they just say a plantation owner or a planter, and what that does is it separates the actual historical legacy that exists there. And because of that, then you have contemporary people who don't get it, and then they don't want to get it, right? Because they've learned it this way all their lives, and then all of a sudden that isn't the way it was. The whole truth wasn't being told, and that can only be fixed through collaborations, through communications. We talked about just reconciliation. I mean, that organizations should be working together. I'll give an example. Like the 223 Foundation partners with in another organization in Glenn County, a Better Glenn, and they've both been pushing and forcefully really pushing to have changes, actual changes and locally, in regards to social justice. Well, those organizations should also be partnering with 100 Miles, right? With the Georgia Conservancy, right? Because we know that those very people are also dealing with environmental challenges, whether it's a Superfund site, whether it's the smell that's going on in Brunswick. All of these things are interconnected. We are all fighting the same battle, and we need the state, like the board of DNR, to actually see us and see what's happening and say, how is it that we can engage rather than try to fix things without understanding the historical legacy that goes along with it. Because I think that if people truly understood that, then their views would be different. Their ways of engagement would be different. It would not look like what it looks like right now. It just would not.
Jazz, that partnership. I think about an organization. I think about, we can talk about scales of economy. There are also scales of ecology, and there are scales of sociology, and all of that has to come together. I'm gonna say it. It's gonna, there needs to be a decentralization of some of these paradigms and ideas from statewide organizations, and they're mired in a paradigm. It's sort of like you get too far out there in that mud at low tide, and it's gonna be hard for you to get back in. They're in a certain place.
Yeah.
And sometimes in order to get back, you got to leave your boots out there, get on your belly and crawl back. And they need to leave those old boots behind. And that requires getting off of patriarchy. It requires divorcing yourself of this privilege of paradigm. And I say privilege of paradigm because if you don't have to think differently, then you're just always in that same place. And certain people are comfortable in the same place.
That's right.
Right? And mindset wise. So I think it takes things like a Sapelo Project. It takes different people running things to have different perspectives. Otherwise, the same people are making the sausage, and they're doing what they want. So part of this for me is about partnering, but you find different partnerships, as Jazz said. There really is no difference between civil rights and environmental justice. There's no difference. Those are braided streams, right?
That's right.
So you can't expect people to live their fullest lives in the pursuit of life, liberty, and fullest happiness if they don't have drinking water, right? If they can't wash their clothes in the water, if they're breathing dirtier air than those people who live over there.
That's right.
So those things have to be linked. And until we understand that critical linkage, we're going to continue to be siloed and stuck in this mud in these old paradigms. And it's going to take people doing different things. This is different tonight, right? Yeah. This is a different kind of thing. So more.
Drew, I think you accidentally muted yourself, but maybe you were done.
Yeah, well, I think, Megan, there's a lot to be said here, and I'm already up on a bunch of soapboxes, but I really feel like some of what needs to happen is big conservation. Yeah. Big conservation needs to get out of the way. And it seems to me, I don't know the infrastructure. 100 Miles is operating at a scale that can work. It seems mobile to me. Everybody has their issues, but I watch organizations work, and when they're smaller and mobile, it's easier to get empathy into the system.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead. Yes.
Oh no, I guess I always, and for me, the way Drew you talked about is interchangeable, and it's interconnected. And you talked about, you got to be willing to leave your boots out in the mud. I think that, part of that is, that some organizations, whether it's the state organizations or whoever they may be, have to also be willing to, admit when their viewpoint has been wrong, and just simply say, let's change how we're doing this. This isn't working. We've been doing it this way for 50 years, and we've been getting the same results. And life isn't getting better for our constituents or the people that, the lands that we're supposed to be managing or whatever it may be. So let's try something. Let's do it. Let's stop doing it the way that we're doing it, which can be hard to do. And I know there are politics that are involved in that. But still, sometimes the pattern is very obvious when it's not working.
Well, I want to dive into this a little bit more, and I appreciate you mentioning the scale of 100 miles. What we deal with every day, and I think about probably 95% of my day, is a decision maker, right? How do we convince the people with power to do things differently? And I know you're talking about conservation organizations. I'm not talking about conservation organizations. I'm talking about entities like the state legislature, like the DNR board, like the city council in Darien, or the historic preservation board in McIntosh County, right? Like those people are our neighbors. We see them in the grocery store, and we drop our kids off with them at school. And if we are having a hard time getting them to value what we have to say, then we're in trouble. And so I would love to get your perspective on, the conservation movement absolutely needs to change. But even if we change, those decision makers also have to change. And so if we could talk about that a little bit, I would really appreciate that. Because what I want to do from this session, and we've already kind of started to do it, is to come up with an agenda that actually causes this change. Yes, in our organizations, but also in our communities.
I think, when you're talking about, Jazz mentioned in his introduction, talking about bridging, right? And I think part of the problem in that people not listening or seeing us, as Jazz said, is, again, that they sort of tune out the message, right? And so I think if you find willing partners, so someone who's not in conservation, but willing to work towards common goals, because these are all common goals, then you come empowered by partnership already. And there are people that are willing, and organizations that are willing to do that, but we sometimes don't see them. So, it's sort of like going into a community, as Jazz said, and doing research and wondering where you can find thus and so, but you never ask the people who were there where you could find it. So, I go, for example, to, to things like board structure. And yeah, and I know there's a lot of politics involved in it, but there's also a lot of money, the give and the get and all that sort of stuff. That those things have to be changed or modified in such a way that you. If you do that, if you look at these values differently, then I think people begin not to close their doors before you get there. Does that make sense? They close their doors because they say, oh, here come those people to talk about climate change and sea level rise again. No, we're coming to talk about this community, and we have this partner with us. So, I look, for example, here I look at somebody like the Center for Air's Property Preservation,
mm-hmm.
And what they're doing. And I mean, it's obvious connections to conservation, but it's also just about legacy, right? And it's pro bono legal assistance that that empowers people. And then next thing you know, you've got a community that's empowered behind you, as opposed to just the same old, same old.
And just to add to that, what you were saying, Megan, talking about, the people, that are the leaders that are in our local communities. Part of this is that people, like, I don't believe that people are ignorant to what is right. I just think sometimes they don't care because they don't feel like it affects them and it's not their issue. Or they just don't have the courage to stand up against, systems that have been in place for a very long time. Glenn County is an example. You had a brutal murder in broad daylight, and then you had the authorities come to the scene where Ahmaud Arbery is dying and no one renders aid. 12, 13 officers on the scene, not one person, but nobody's reprimanded. We know that the men didn't, even get arrested until the GBI steps in and somebody decides to finally do the right thing after the community just demands, that there's justice. And I think it should not take, something heinous for us to fight for one another. It should not take that for local leaders to stand up and have the courage, to do what's right. And Drew, just, off of what you were saying about when I mentioned, bridges, we want to build bridges, but there also has to be some accountability and some change, there. We need these organizations to hold themselves accountable and say, we need to go in a different direction, to change things, So, and in our situation, it's an uphill battle, even with local organizations like you mentioned, Megan, whether, locally, in McIntosh, it is an uphill battle, because we're dealing with people that have money, and they have power. And so that doesn't yield easy.
Well, I'd love to take some questions from the audience at this point. I mean, you both have amazing stories, and I know people we have some questions that I know people really have been waiting for a while to ask. One of the questions is to you, Drew, and it's it says many African Americans did not grow up in the rural environment with familial connections to nature. As a result, the impressions of getting out in nature and on former plantations are only of the pain and oppression and the death to our ancestors. How can we begin to relearn our connection to celebrate a positive legacy in what you called paradise?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily, I mean, it's paradise. I would qualify that word. I think so a couple of things. One of the first ways to connect, it's easy. It's food, right? Our food comes from this earth. And I don't care if you live in Midtown Atlanta, your food is coming out of some soil somewhere. Even if it's a burger that's coming out of a fast food joint. So connections to food are important for people to understand that we're all connected to the earth. The whole issue sort of our legacy is an important story to tell, and don't shrink away from those stories at all. I think so much has been done to sort of push us away from those. Now, Jazz talked about accountability. You got to tell whole stories and these places that are now sort of event spaces and weddings under the oaks and those sorts of things. Well, I hope people hear the ghosts, right? So that they understand that history. But I think that which we fear owns us still. When we turn that fear around, then we can begin to own the narrative, right? And we need to own the narrative. We need to tell it, because that's a story of overcome. Yes, it's a story of oppression, but it's a story ultimately of overcome. So, I work on a plantation up here at Clemson. It's a plantation. You call it what it is. This was John C. Calhoun's plantation, calling the names of those people. So people began to understand, and it's going to be painful at first. But as my friend says, until the pain of not changing becomes greater than the pain of change, you're going to stay the same. So you got to tell the stories, and people got to bear the pain.
It makes me think about, so I have a very good friend of mine, and we've known each other, since college, and we're always having these type conversations. So he grew up in Atlanta, very, very, challenging does not even begin to express, how he grew up. And we met in college. He was on a football scholarship, but we both studied theater and communications, became, really very close. And he wrote this book. It's called Blindsided by the Walking Dead. I know it sounds totally crazy, but I'm just gonna tell the story a little bit. So he grew up in this place called Perry Homes in Atlanta. And just to come out and get out of where he was is just a story in itself. And the irony is he got these roles, these film roles, that kind of depicted these parts of his life and these challenges in his life. And I talk about him because he and I always talk about how we have to express the truth to people. He says, truth and love. So we have to tell we have to tell the whole truth, right? But whether and be compassionate about it. But the truth has to be told. And if we don't tell that, then what's the use of it? Like you say, if you build a recreational center on top of, what used to be a cemetery or a burial site, or a plantation, it isn't enough that you go there and just say, well, that's where that used to be. And you note it in a book and you keep going. And that's the problem. There's no emotional connection to the truth, to the whole truth. the absolute truth. You know, I always read bunches of books about, you know, Thomas Spalding is the, you know, main, you know, was the main plantation owner on Sapelo. You read all these books about him, but you rarely read something where where he's in a bad light. That's crazy, right? He owned generations of people. He was a slave owner, but you hear about his brilliance as a planter. That's what you read about. And when you have generations of people just seeing it from that viewpoint, then that's when they go, oh, well, you know, that thing called slavery or Jim Crow or whatever it was, it couldn't have been that bad, right? You know, it could have been that bad. And that's where some of that mentality comes from. You know, whether they're, you know, learning about Tunis Campbell and they go, oh, well, you know, it wasn't that bad what happened to him. I mean, you know, hey, maybe he got benefits. It's that same mentality, like those two law enforcement officials, the sheriffs that were in, I think, Hamilton, Georgia, that had their body cams on recording them and they didn't know it, their audio, when they were just talking and just going on and on about these viewpoints. But that's where that mentality comes from. You know, that whole idea that not knowing and understanding that legacy leads to the ignorance of today. And people wonder, well, why is there a Black Lives Matter, you know, movement? Well, you know, that's why, you know, that's part of the reason why, because we have been saying it, we've been living it, we've been experiencing it, you know, and we're part of that ecosystem. And, you know, the conservation movement, you know, like we've stated before, that whole concept of the environment that we grow up in. No one should be growing up, you know, having to, you know, get soil dug up because there's mercury, you know, in the soil, or PCBs in the water, or there's toxic waste. I mean, that should not be happening, or you know, children or people, you know, dying from, you know, from cancer, you know, because of these sites, you know, and this toxicity that's going on physically in these environments, you know, that just should not be happening. And those movements should be one and the same. We should be fighting for each other in the same way. I'm sorry, I went on a rant.
Amen.
No,
Amen.
it's good. Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
you know, I want to just, you know, Jess, I just wanted to add one thing, Megan. It occurs to me two things, and we never think of it, but the kind of ignorance that Jess is talking about, ignorance coupled with impunity, that's the ultimate in privilege, because you choose to live in this ignorance, right? But so you can continue to do what you want to do and not care.
Right.
And that's you know, we gotta solve that. We gotta get at that. I'm not exactly sure how, but it starts with caring. Man, it just starts at that's golden rule kind of stuff, that you can stand by and just watch somebody die.
Yeah, and you know,
or dump. I'm sorry, go ahead, Jess.
Oh no, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I mean, and just to add to that, you know, you can call out these behaviors, you know, and it doesn't mean that, you know, you can still call out these behaviors from these people, because we want our systems to be better. You know, I want the McIntosh County Historic Preservation Commission to be better. So it's okay for me to call it out. You know,
yes,
I want it to be better. I want the city council to be better. I want the local government. I want the Glenn County Police Department to be better. They're not going to be better unless they get called out, unless there's advocacy, you know, because just like, you know, they are, you know, that system ignored, you know, Ahmaud Arbery as he lay there dying, you know, that's the same system that is ignoring all of the environmental hazards and everything that's affecting people and is killing all of us. That's poisoning all of us. It's under the same umbrella. And the only way that we really, truly can make a change is together, is through that advocacy. And that's what I love, honestly, about, you know, just, you know, 100 miles. And I'll you know, say this, Megan, is when we came to you, and after, you know, dealing with Butler and talking about this, Don, and the support that you provided, I have to be honest, I was just surprised. I was just like, wow, they actually care, right? They care about the people, about what's happening with the people, what's happening with the community, and recognizing that the people are a vital part of the ecosystem. And if we can get everybody to start doing that, I don't know how that happens, Drew. I think that, you know, a change gonna come, but.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, Jazz. It is our privilege to work in communities, and you know, we really work hard to not be the voice of the Georgia coast, but to elevate others so that they can be the voice and speak for the things that they love and want to see protected. So thanks for working with us. There's a couple of questions here that are in the question and answer that I want to try and get to. One of them is, if you could wave a magic wand and have state legislators truly understand one thing about the environmental justice movement, what would it be? That's a hard question.
That it's job one. Mm-hmm. You can talk about employment, you can talk about the economy, you can talk about anything else. But if people can't breathe, either because of police knees on their necks or because of dirty air, they can't work. They can't be happy. So if you have not clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, nothing else matters.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree. There, you know, how can, you know, people see something better for themselves if they're battling all of these things that are really a violation of our humanity? You know, it's a violation of our humanity if, you know, a child is sick, you know, because of, you know, the water. That should not be happening. It's just unacceptable in all ways. You know, and even protecting, you know, our sea life is, you know, it is all one and the same.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Another question in the chat, in the question and answer is, are there any examples of successful campaigns that y'all know of where communities are standing up to gentrification on lands with rich African American history and turning around the narrative?
You know, I would say, well, our story remains to be told as far as dealing with the current issue that we have now. But, you know, back in 2012, when we were dealing with, you know, the astronomical raising of our taxes, you know, back then, we did get to what I would call, you know, a victory in a sense. It wasn't a full victory, but, you know, we were able to get, you know, most things in our favor. I mean, but we're still talking about a 4 or 5 year, you know, long battle. We didn't have a lot of allies during that time to support us. And like I said, again, we had you know, a tax consultant, Jeffrey George, and, you know, Michael Thurman, and an attorney, Jay Roberts. And I mean, and that was pretty much it. And we were just kind of out there. But it was a measured success. It was a measured success, not a full one in my eyes, because I think legislation of some type should have come out of that, and that did not happen. So it could happen again, is what I'm saying. We're still vulnerable, but that would be the one example that I could think of from my viewpoint.
I have a hard time thinking of a specific community. I go again back to an organization, and I think about, you know, Center for Heirs Property and what they are doing in communities and for rural landowners, to allow them to not be pushed out and to lose your land for pennies on the dollar, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's a critical cog in that wheel of helping communities hold on to what they have, and then they can do better from there. But if you've been pushed out, you know, you have no power. So that's an empowering thing for communities, I think.
Right. Well, I think I have time for one more question, and it's a little bit of a hard question, but I think it's an important one. And it's been asked a couple of times, so I'm going to rephrase and kind of try and capture the context. But we talked a lot about the negative histories associated with some of these properties, especially when talking about African American history. And then there's also there's the negative connotation and the negative memories for African American people, but there's also a negative acknowledgement that white Americans also have to come to terms with. And so how do we foster a sense of reconciliation and healing together? Because quite honestly, both sides, or both races of Southern people struggle with coming to terms with our past. And so I would like to talk about that, and that's been asked a couple of times in the Q&A. How do we do that together? And I know it starts with conversations like this, but we have to keep it moving. And I would love to get y'all's thoughts about how we do that.
You want me to? I'll go first.
Go ahead, Jack.
You know, that's a tough question, Megan. I mean, you know, it has to start with, you know, some level of dialogue. You know, obviously, I think, you know, part of it is hearing communities, hearing people, you know, actually listening to their voices in those issues that are occurring. I think that's, you know, I think that is a, you know, is a big part of it. And I have to say, you know, even with our work on Butler Island, I think about, you know, just the conservation work that comes along with it, because that in itself, that project in itself can spur, you know, the conversations that do need to be had. It can open the door, you know, to those conversations. But I think along with those conversations that people just have, you know, prepared and understand that there's a lot of pain, you know, that's there. There's his historical hurt, you know, that's there. You know, I wouldn't be honest if I didn't say that I have so many different emotions in me when it comes to, you know, Ahmaud. I mean, the amount of anger that I feel, you know, not just because he was a family member, but that could happen to any human being. And I'm angry about a system that is designed to continue to allow those things to happen. And I think, you know, in conversation that, you know, people, you know, and white people that are part of that conversation, Caucasian people that are part of that conversation, have to recognize that pain and that anger, you know, is there, and rightfully so, you know, and understand that though we are both coming down the same road, you know, what we got on opposite sides was completely different. You know, benefits on one and consequences and repercussions and death on the other. And that's a tough conversation to have. It's tough to have a conversation with people knowing that, oh my goodness, this could get extremely uncomfortable. Well, you think that's uncomfortable, you know, try being this, you know, for a while, and living in discomfort sometimes. So, and that comes along with the territory. So I just really think it's got to be, you know, frank and honest, you know, conversations. And then there has to actually be, you know, push for action and push for change. It should not have taken a year later for the governor of the state of Georgia to go, well, we're going to repeal the citizens of this 150-year-old citizens arrest law. A year later, and I don't even know if that would have happened if they didn't lose Georgia. You can't make that make sense. But that's part of what I think has to happen in during that dialogue. We have to recognize that there are a lot of emotions there, and you have to be prepared for that, especially if you are part of the power structure side of things. So
well said, Jess. I again, I concur. I think again to be able to sit and people want silver bullet solutions with silver plated intent. And they come at it and they want everything to be solved in a single funding cycle or a single political cycle. And this is evolution, and there is no end to this. They want an inclusion, diversity, and engagement siloed in their organization and expect everything to be cured because you've hired one person. Well, that has to be part of your mission. It has to be part of your life. It has to be part of your existence. And daily, you're gonna have to live with some of this pain, right? And you learn to live with it. I tell people, they're like, man, yeah, it must be hard being you. Yeah, it's difficult, but guess what? There's also joy in it.
Yeah.
We find we're not joyless people, but guess what? We've had to learn to live with pain. And so I think, Megan, part of this is folks not wanting to put a pretty ribbon on everything at the end of every meeting. There need to be open-ended questions that you go home thinking about, that wake you up and you say, well, what can I do? Or when you look in the mirror, you say, am I one of those or am I one of those? And so figuring that out, all policy begins with personal agenda. All of it. So when you look in the mirror in the morning, you got a decision to make about who you're going to be, whether you're going to be on this side of it or whether you're going to be on that side of it. And then we can go forward from there.
Okay, well, I really appreciate both of y'all tonight. I appreciate your stories. I appreciate your spirits. I appreciate your patience and your commitment to making this world a better place. Thank you so much. We're gonna sign off, but before I do that, I need to show a few slides about our next couple of sessions. And so I wanna thank you both. And I think our producer behind the scenes is gonna share her screen. Thank you. So again, thank you to Drew and Jazz, but also thank you to our audience. Without you, we wouldn't be able to do this conversation. And like I said earlier, and Jazz and Drew mentioned it a few times, we have to begin to tell a different story about our coast. And it is up to us to take what we've discovered tonight and what we've heard out into the world so that we can continue discovering and we can do something with our knowledge and our relationships. As you know, our conference is 5 weeks long and we only have 2 sessions left. Next week, I am excited to remind you that we'll have with us 2 well-known leaders in our national environmental movement, and they are Bill McKibben and Delaney Reynolds. And their conversation will be moderated by a well-known leader here in Georgia, the executive director of the Georgia Conservation Voters, Briante McCorkle. The 3 of them will discuss the question, how can we save our future? And they'll talk about the evolution of our environmental movement, where it has been and where it needs to go into the future to conquer the big issues that we have to conquer. I hope you will join us, as it promises to be a wonderful conversation. And that conversation will take place on Tuesday night at 7 o'clock. And if you haven't already registered, please do so. So again, I appreciate the time of our speakers tonight and the time that they took to prepare for this conversation. And I am gonna put you on the hook to keep working with us because this conversation needs to continue into the future. So I hope you all have a great night and I will see you next week. Thank you for being here.
All right, thank you. Thank you everyone for having us.